Well, happy Mother's Day. If this is the first time you're hearing that or thinking that phrase, I encourage you to hit pause on this video and go say Happy Mother's Day to your mom or to the significant women in your life, whether they are moms or not. I encourage you to go say Happy Mother's Day to them. This is an incredibly special day, and we are thankful that you have chosen to worship with us here at Trailhead on this Mother's Day. It was way back in 2005 when my wife became a mother and I became a father for the first time. And I will never forget that. It was in February of 2005. At the time, I was a pastor of a church that did Sunday morning services and also did Sunday evening services. And we went through the day, we went through Sunday and got to the end of the day after the Sunday evening service. And JD, my wife, came to me and said, "Hey, I think we might need to go to the hospital." And so we take off, go to the hospital. She's 9 months pregnant. We get there and they tell us, yes, you are starting to go into labor. Her water had broken, all of that kind of good stuff. And so on Sunday evening, we get there and they say, look, this is going to happen pretty quick. At any time this could happen. So we are going to keep you here in the hospital overnight. And we stayed in the hospital overnight and nothing happened. And then Monday morning came and they said, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to induce you so that the labor will go ahead and move along and you can get through this. And they induced her on Monday morning and she went through all the contractions and all of that stuff and nothing happened. And then we get to Monday night and they say, we're going to induce you again. And they induced her again and nothing happened. And then we get to Tuesday morning, they induced her a third time. Nothing happened. Finally, Tuesday afternoon, late in the afternoon, they come to us, and the doctor, I think just worn out with the process at this point, says, look, we may have to do a C-section here. And both JD and I said, you could have said that like 2 days ago, right? And so they got her all prepped. They got her ready. They gave me one of those, hospital gowns and the hairnet, the whole thing. And I got all dressed up, and they took her into the operating room, and I walked in. If you have never experienced this, I walk into the operating room. There are doctors and nurses standing around. They're already in the process of doing the C-section. They've got a little stool for me that's right at JD's head, and it's behind a curtain. So the curtain is there to obviously keep dads and maybe moms from getting sick at the sights that they see of the operation. But I'm sitting there and I'm waiting and I'm watching, and I just couldn't stand it. So finally I decided I am going to stand up and I'm going to look at what's going on. I peeked over the curtain, and this is what I saw. Okay, maybe that's not exactly what I saw. I don't figure you would want to see the whole operating thing going on. They were pulling stuff out that I was thinking you shouldn't take. That needs to go back in, right? But they were also taking out this precious baby. This picture is a couple of days old, and so it's amazing how much hair she had when she came into the world, but as a brand new dad, I'm looking at my baby thinking, this is incredible. This changes my world. This changes my life. Pretty soon after that, we had the same thing happened again. I mean, just a little over a year later, we have another one come into the world. And here's a picture of her, our second daughter. I chose this picture specifically because this, I believe, is the only time in the first 6 months of her life where she was not screaming and crying. And so we captured this moment and held on to it like it's pure gold, right? And so we had our second daughter, and only a couple of years after that, we have a third daughter that comes along. And as you can see here, she's looking at her new sisters thinking, what have I just stepped into? And so we have all of these daughters that come into the world. And I, like any parent, look at these pictures of my children and I just think they are absolutely beautiful, right? You ask a parent, and pretty much every parent will tell you that their kids, their children, when they are born, they are absolutely beautiful. Let's be honest. Babies are kind of generic. They're almost all the same. The question is, what color are they going to be? How much hair are they going to have? And are they going to have like a cone head or a round head? Other than that, all the features are almost exactly the same, but every parent will tell you, my child was absolutely beautiful, is absolutely beautiful, because this child has changed their world. It has changed their entire lives. It's so incredible to think of that on Mother's Day at this time. And for many of you mothers, you're thinking the same thing. Yeah, maybe all the other babies are generic, but mine wasn't generic. My baby was absolutely beautiful. We're actually going to look at a story today that continues the thought of beautiful babies on Mother's Day. We are still in our series that we are calling Refocus. Actually, today we are wrapping up this series. We've been walking through the book of Hebrews together, and we are coming to the end of the book of Hebrews now. And with that, what we are going to see today is we're going to see the story of two parents who show us in an incredible way what it means to have enduring faith. And so if you are familiar with the book of Hebrews, maybe you are familiar with Hebrews chapter 11. Maybe you read it this week for the first time ever. But if you've been around the church for any length of time, you probably have heard something about Hebrews chapter 11, because this is what is known as the great chapter of faith. The hall of faith is the corny way to say that as a believer. But this is a chapter that just walks through story after story after story of people from earlier in the Bible that lived out their faith in an incredible way. I would imagine that some of you could even tell me some of the stories that are listed in Hebrews chapter 11. You might remember that he talks about this guy named Noah, the guy who builds the huge boat, right? And all the world is looking at him and kind of saying, you have lost your mind. And he's saying, it's going to rain. It's coming. It's coming. And in Hebrews chapter 11, it talks about this guy, Noah. It also goes on to talk about Abraham. It goes on to talk about Moses. It goes on to talk about this woman named Rahab. Here's my challenge for you, though, right now. Even if you've been in the church for a long time, I'm guessing you will not know this Hebrews 11 answer. So here it is. Who is the one couple that is mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11? What couple is it that is mentioned as having incredible faith or great faith in this chapter? You may not have even realized that there is a couple that is mentioned together in this chapter. It's their story that we want to look at. They are parents, and the way that they live out their faith gives us this incredible example of what faith is all about, what enduring faith is all about. So Hebrews chapter 11 is where we're going to be. Verse 23 is where we're going to start today. And it simply says this. It says, it was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months when he was born. So there's your answer to the Bible trivia question. The one couple that's mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11 is a couple of faith, is the parents of Moses. And they don't even get the distinction of having their names mentioned here. You have to go all the way back to the book of Exodus to see the names of Moses' parents. So if you go back and look that up, the father of Moses is a guy named Amram, and the mother of Moses is a woman named Jochebed. If you're getting ready to have a child, there are two great name options for you right there, Amram and Jochebed. And so they have this child, and something really interesting is going on here. There are a couple of things going on. One of the things that you may have heard me said if you've been following us in this series is that we don't know exactly who the writer of Hebrews is. But I think in what we just read, we got an incredible clue. Here's what I think that little portion of a verse showed us. It shows us that whoever wrote this was definitely, absolutely a man. And here's the reason I would say that. If you go back to the story of the birth of Moses in the book of Exodus, maybe you remember this, but if you go back to the story, it's that whole story of the king of Egypt has ordered the slaughter of all of the young Jewish boys. And so Hebrew mothers are trying to protect their children and keep them from being killed. And so the mother of Moses, Jochebed, she hides him for 3 months. She eventually makes this basket out of reeds and tar and places him out on the river and tells his sister Miriam to go watch him to make sure that he's going to be okay. You may remember that part of the story. If you read that in the book of Exodus, every single event that happens says she hid him. She protected him. She crafted this little floating device out of reeds and tar. She placed him in the water. In fact, the dad is really never even mentioned as being a part of the story. And then we get to the book of Hebrews, and what does the writer of Hebrews do? He says, the parents of Moses hid him for a while. It's kind of like, you know, if you're a mom and you've ever done all the work, and dad ended up getting 50% of the credit. That's what happens in the book of Hebrews. That's what gives me a pretty good clue to say, yep, this guy was a man that wrote this, because he gives credit to both parents in this case. He goes on and the second part of that verse to tell us more. He says this: they, the parents of Moses, they saw that God had given them an unusual child, and they were not afraid to disobey the king's command. I read that in this translation, the New Living Translation, and I'm just thinking, if this is the first time I have read this, God gave them an unusual child. Man, my mind just go like, what did he have, like a third eye? You know, what's going on? Why is he an unusual child? And I think that's a terrible way to translate this, honestly. This is actually a phrase that's used 3 times in the Bible, 3 times altogether. And believe it or not, it is used in the same context every time. So every time that phrase, this unusual child, is used, it's used in telling about the birth of Moses. So the first time is in Exodus chapter 2. Later on in the book of Acts, Stephen recounts the birth of Moses, and he uses the same phrase. And now here in the book of Hebrews, they use the same phrase that in our translation has been translated this unusual child. Really, what is saying here is they are saying that this is a child of exceeding beauty. He was unusually beautiful as a baby. And again, you probably would say, well, that probably comes from Jochebed and from Amram. They're only ones that would look at him and say he was beautiful. Everybody else, oh, it's a baby, right? But that's where we see them. They look at their child and they say, our child is exceedingly beautiful. The reason that's important is because that is what spurs them on to do what they do. Later on, the historian Josephus, he was a Jewish historian that lived around the time of Jesus, just after the time of Jesus, and wrote just after the time of Jesus. And he would recount and say the reason that Moses was considered such a beautiful baby, the reason that's important is because his parents looked on that beauty and said, you know what, this is unusual. This child is favored by God, is blessed by God. And Moses was actually their 3rd child. They had been through this process before, right? But they see this child and they say, he is so beautiful. He is perfect in form and in every way. And so they interpreted that as being the favor of God on their child. They thought, apparently God has big plans for my child because he is exceptionally beautiful. That's the reason they're not afraid to disobey the king's orders. They're not afraid to hide their child. They're not afraid to eventually put him in the basket in the river, because they believe God is favoring this child. That's where their faith comes from. And that kind of begs this question of, what is it that really causes us to have faith? What is it in our worlds, in our lives, that causes us to look up and say, man, I believe this is going to happen. I've not seen it come to fruition, but I believe that this is happening, or that God is involved in this. What is it that causes that? For the parents of Moses, it was what they saw. Just file that away in your brain for a few minutes. But it's what they saw in their child. It was the beauty that they saw in their child that caused them to have faith. That's just really interesting to me, because some people go through life and they find almost any reason to have faith, right? Some people go through incredible, extreme hardship. And in the midst of their hardship, their faith doesn't wane, it doesn't fall away, it actually gets stronger. But there are other people that go through similar circumstances, and they look all around them and they say, God, why won't you show yourself to me? And it's in those times that their faith just dissipates altogether. So really the question that we're asking today is why is it that some people go through hardship and trial and their faith gets stronger, while some people, almost seemingly from the beginning of life, can't find faith no matter where they look? What is the difference? What causes one to grow while the other falters? And for the parents of Moses, it was what they saw. If you go on, the writer of Hebrews continues the story of Moses, and he starts telling us some of what happens in the life of this young man. In verse 24, it says this: "It was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to share in the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin." And so we see it again right here, right? He has this opportunity. Moses, if you remember the rest of the story, the basket floats down the river, ends up at the feet, so to speak, of the daughter of Pharaoh. She picks up the basket. She ends up being the one that would raise him for most of his young life. After he had been nursed by his mother, he's raised in Pharaoh's household. And so he's got this choice as he becomes a man to stay in Pharaoh's household and pursue every worldly pleasure that you can imagine, or, knowing his heritage, knowing his history, he can choose to identify with the Jewish people, with the Hebrew people, and subject himself to a life of frustration and oppression. And for whatever reason, Moses, by faith, chooses to enjoy a life of oppression rather than a life of pleasures. I think, if we're honest, I think 9 out of 10 of us, if not more, would say, if I've got two options in front of me, a life of pleasure or a life of hardship, I think easily 9 out of 10 of us would say, yeah, I think I'm going to take the life of pleasure. That is just so much more appealing than going through opposition and hardship and suffering and difficulty. But Moses, by faith, says, I am choosing to live a life of oppression, a life of opposition, instead of in a world of pleasure. Why would he do that? What is it that causes some people to have that kind of faith, where it seems like the rest of us are in this camp where we're just trying to get by and our faith is faltering every step that we take? I think you're going to see the answer in just a second. Going on, the writer of Hebrews continues telling the story of Moses, and he says this in verse 26. He says, "He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward." And just hitting pause for a second here, as you think about the great reward, so many people hear that, the rewards of heaven, and they think, that means I'm going to have a massive mansion and I'm going to have all the material stuff that I could ever want. But when Scripture talks about the reward of God, what it's always talking about is it's talking about more of God himself. God is so much better than any material pleasure that you could ever have. And so that's exactly what Moses was looking forward to. The next verse says this: it was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He kept right on going. and I read that earlier this week. And as I read that, right before it says he kept on going, it says he left the land of Egypt and he kept right on going. It may kind of conjure up this image in your mind, like it did in mine, of Forrest Gump, right? And he just starts running and he keeps running and he keeps running and he gets to the opposite coastline and he just kept on going. And it almost, in that context, sounds like Moses just gets out of Egypt and he keeps going as far as he can keep going to get out of there. But what you're going to see in just a second is it's really saying he walked out of Egypt under the oppression that he was dealing with, under the hardship that he was struggling with. And in his faith, he kept going. His faith endured. He did not give up. He did not back down. He kept going in his faith. And again, the question is, what causes that to happen? How do we get to that point? How can we have that kind of enduring faith? And the writer of Hebrews gives us, I believe, what the exact answer is next. He says, Moses kept going because he kept his eyes on the one who is invisible. Now, do you remember the beginning of this whole story? What was it again that caused Amram and Jochebed to have faith? It was what they saw, right? It was what they had their eyes on. You come to this place, and it's told us of the incredible life of Moses, where he's gone through all of these things. He has gone through being raised in Pharaoh's palace, to the place where he actually went to the opposite end of the spectrum. In the prime of his life, for 40 years, from age 40 to about age 80, he was an unknown. He was herding sheep out on a hillside by himself. And in the midst of being an unknown, he kept going in his faith. Eventually, he goes down and confronts, at the command of God, confronts Pharaoh. And he keeps going in his faith to the point where God causes him to pass through the Red Sea on dry ground. You remember the story. And he keeps going in faith. What is it that pressed him into that? The writer of Hebrews just said it was that he kept his eyes on the one who is invisible. It was his perspective that caused his world to work out, his faith to work out the way that it was supposed to work out. That's the key that the writer of Hebrews gives us. He says it's this seeing, it's this vision, it's this perspective that we have. Remember what he's doing. He's writing to people that are enduring hardship. They're facing imprisonment. They are being cast out of their inner circles of friends and family, and they're facing all sorts of persecution. And what the writer of Hebrews is telling them, he's saying, in the midst of the hardship, in the midst of the difficulties, in the midst of these times, keep going. Keep your eyes on the one who is greater than your circumstances. I think what he's saying ultimately, and what we are seeing from Moses here, is that you can't always change your circumstances, but you can change your perspective. That's what the writer of Hebrews wants us to grab onto. If you want your faith to be an enduring faith, it may be where you're fixing your eyes that matters most. You cannot necessarily change all of your circumstances, but the way that you see your circumstances, the one that you keep your eyes on during those circumstances, makes all the difference in the way that you process your faith and hang on to faith. So you can't always change your circumstances, but you can change your perspective. If you go through the book of Hebrews, or if you've been with us the last several weeks as we've been walking through Hebrews, you may realize at this point that there's really one concept, there's one thought, even one word that summarizes this entire letter that's sent out. And that one word is endurance or perseverance. It's this idea of continuing to go forward even in the difficult days, even in the hard seasons of life, not backing down, not giving up, not walking away. And as we get to the end of the book, he brings us to this incredible conclusion where he says, and here's the way that it works. Here's how endurance happens in your faith. You take your eyes off of the things that are right around you and you put them on the one who is bigger and greater than any of your circumstances. If you're anything like me, you go through hardship, you go through difficulty, you go through trying times, and what you tend to do is you tend to focus almost entirely on that circumstance, right? You sit awake at night thinking through, how can I work through this? How can I get beyond this? How can I get out of this problem, out of this circumstance? Or you just mull over, what can I do to change the situation around me? We get fixated, our eyes get locked in on the circumstance itself. And I think for a lot of people who are believers, we sit there with our eyes fixated on the circumstance, and we cry out to God at the same time, and we say, God, do you see what I'm seeing? Are you understanding what's going on here? God, why aren't you changing this circumstance, right? And all the while we're crying out to God, we're keeping our eyes and our minds and our hearts fixated on the circumstance. And the writer of Hebrews comes and says, here's the key. Here's what Moses did. Here's what his parents did. Here's what these incredible men and women of faith have done throughout the centuries. They have paused long enough to take their eyes off of the circumstance and put their eyes on the one who is greater than any situation in life. What would happen in our worlds if we just changed our view? What would happen if we, instead of looking at the trial and the difficulty, turned our eyes completely to God and looked at him in the midst of all of the hardship that we were dealing with? I think the writer of Hebrews says this is the incredible secret to refocusing your faith in the way that God intends it to be focused. You may not be able to change your circumstances, but you can always change your perspective. Let's step into that this week. Father, we are so incredibly thankful that you're a God that we can turn to at any time. That you're a God who doesn't walk away. You don't leave us. You remind us that your love for us cannot be quenched. And so I pray that you would help us this week to take our eyes off of the difficulties in front of us and refocus on you, refocus on what matters most. We love you so much, and we pray these things in the power of your name, Jesus. Amen.